It is today's last, it is today's final topic, and the good news is we have then successfully mastered the first day of our Third Annual Madrid Conference on Austrian Economics. It is with special pleasure that I look forward to this keynote speech held by Professor Huerta de Soto, and let me give you the reason for that. I don't want to bore you with my anecdotal details here, but it was when I, in my previous life, worked as an investment banker, speaking to my colleagues and asking them which economists they thought had the biggest influence these days. Now, to my left sat Thorsten Polleit. I need not tell you what he thought. But to my right sat Fritz Engelhardt, and he mentioned a name I had never heard before, Huerta de Soto. And I thought, well, okay, you better dig it up. You better need to look this up so you won't be caught flat-footed. That was the first time I ever came across your name, Professor. And to the very date, you can see how all this has developed and where we stand today. The second thing I wish to highlight, and I'm not saying too much if I say I always believe that these keynote lectures are kind of a highlight of our conference, not because they perhaps are more interesting or better funded than other papers, but they always manage to come up with a very good mix of what is recent and what is important, whilst at the same time being very well funded on an academic basis. And I remember 2016 when I published a note referring to the question whether or not the European Union, might sound familiar, could suffer something we refer to as the Japanification. That paper was quite warmly received, and I remember presenting it in front of a private bank in Luxembourg, which then, towards the end, said, well, thank you very much, Dr. Dukes. Now that the crisis is over, what do you think of these impacts? And I thought, well, thank you, but there must be misunderstanding. I never mentioned that the crisis is over. It is far from any such thing. The mere fact that 4 years on, we get to rediscover the element of Japanification, ladies and gentlemen, beautifully highlights that this crisis is far from over. Yes, I believe I have done enough talking for tonight, so let us give it over to Professor Huerta de Soto, who reminded me to remind you that his paper is available once you leave the auditorium later tonight. To your left, it's been printed out for you to take out. Thank you very much, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to Professor Diggs for his nice, as always, introduction. Well, I will begin remembering that according to Hayek, and he wrote that in his Pure Theory of Capital, the best test of a good economist is understanding the principle that demand for commodities is not demand for labor. This means that it is an error to think that an increase in the demand for consumer goods gives rise to an increase in the employment. Whoever holds this belief fails to understand the most basic principles of capital theory. Because the demand for consumer goods is always at the expense of saving and the demand for investment goods. And since most workers are employed in the investment stages farthest from consumption, an increase in consumptions always occurs at the expense of net employment. Well, I would add to this my own test of a good economist, the Professor Huerta de Soto's test. According to my own criteria, the best test to determine whether we are dealing with a good economist or not is to check if he knows and understands why it is a grave error to believe that the injection and manipulation of money can bring about economic prosperity. Neither Keynesians nor monetarists would pass my test, nor Hayek's test, of course, and therefore they would fail and would not pass my university course For instance, Keynes never understood that it is possible to earn money even when sales of consumer goods do not rise, because profit is always equal to income minus cost. And income may remain constant, but if you reduce cost, you can still make money. And one of the best ways to reduce costs at the margin is to replace relatively more expensive labor with capital equipment. And of course, the capital equipment that is going to replace labor, especially in the stages closest to consumption, must be produced by someone. And it generates a huge number of jobs. Machines never harm employment. On the contrary, machines create employment on a massive scale. The same could be said of one of the economists who, together with Keynes, has caused the most severe damage to economic science, mainly because in his book entitled A Monetary History of the United States, he defends the wrong idea that the Great Depression of 1929 resulted from the Federal Reserve failure to manipulate and inject enough money. Obviously, I am referring to Milton Friedman, who is now so highly praised by all central bankers who favor ultra-lax monetary policies. And of course, Milton Friedman would also have failed my test for not understanding that monetary injections and manipulations are never the way to sustainable economic prosperity. History illustrates again and again the soundness of the essential question Hayek and myself ask to determine whether an economist really knows what he's talking about. For example, we can look at the massive influx of precious metals into Spain after the discovery of the Americas. Far from generating prosperity, this influx of gold made Spain a wasted land, an economic desert which did not recover the economic prosperity of its neighboring countries until many centuries later. In fact, the arrival of gold drove nominal prices up, and it sank the purchasing power of the monetary unit in Spain. As a result, Spanish products ceased to be competitive, and it became much cheaper to buy abroad. As soon as the gold entered the country, it left our borders to pay for massive imports. The traditional products of the Iberian Peninsula were no longer competitive, and their producers went bankrupt and were reduced and forced to emigrate. And as a result, basically, there remained only 3 professional careers for any young Spaniard at that time. Remember, the church, the sea, or the royal household. In other words, one could become a clergyman or enter a convent and live on ecclesiastical income, or one could cross the Atlantic in search of one's fortune in the Americas, or serve the king as a soldier in Flanders. And this accounts for the traditional economic poverty and underdevelopment of Spain for centuries, which was the final result of the ultra-lax increase in the monetary supply produced by the gold influx. Another historical illustration is provided by the emergence of fractional reserve banking. Another attempt, at first a private one, and later in cooperation with central banks and public authorities, to always inject more and more money based on the idea that creating loans from nothing without the backing of real saving is always very good and favorable. As you know, many economists have defended this wrong idea. For instance, Joseph Alois Schumpeter, who therefore would not pass my test either and would fail my examination. But we will not now discuss the Austrian business cycle theory and the destabilizing effects of fractional reserve banking, because you are already familiar with the content of my book, hopefully, Money, Bank Credit and Economic Cycles. Finally, Another very clear illustration of the importance of our test can be found in the wild monetary manipulations and injections with which authorities around the world have reacted to the last great recession of 2008. This reaction culminates in what we will refer to as the Japanese economic illness, or the malady of economic Japanization. What does this syndrome or disease, this Japanese economic illness, consist of? We will first take a look at its symptoms and analyze them from the perspective of the Austrian school. Then we will consider the extent to which this illness is contagious and exists a risk of transmission to other economic areas, especially to the European Union. But before we begin to analyze the symptoms of this sickness, let us briefly outline the historical background of the Japanese economy. And we must go back to the 1960s, and particularly to the 1970s and early 80s. While it may come as a surprise now, during those years, the Japanese economy was one of the most admired in the world. Almost in every business school, the so-called Japanese economic miracle was studied with detail. Many people praised and even worshipped the Japanese economic and entrepreneurial culture, which in a way seemed to be a model of success. Japanese workers were strongly protected in every company, in a quasi-familiar atmosphere, in exchange for the absolute reciprocal loyalty of each employee. This took place in a context of constant innovation and economic growth in exports. It is true that the model largely rested on copying prior innovations and discoveries from the United States and Europe, and then launching them in the market at much lower prices and at a level of quality that was initially quite acceptable and later even very high. However, this idealized model concealed the fact that both the Japanese culture and especially the Japanese economy were, and still are, extremely rigid and interventionist, and that what appeared during those years to be a highly prosperous and a stable economy actually rested on a huge bubble of artificial growth, monetary manipulation, and credit expansion. The bubble took shape mainly around the real estate market. And in that euphoric and speculative environment, the large Japanese industrial conglomerates, the so-called zaibatsus, became de facto speculative financial institutions, which, as a secondary activity, relatively speaking, also manufacture vehicles, electronic devices, and so on. As was predicted by our Austrian business cycle theory, at the beginning of the 1990s, the Japanese bubble burst. Just to give you an idea, the Nikkei index fell from 30,000 yen at the start of the 90s to 12,000 yen 10 years later. And still today, nearly 30 years later, the Japanese stock market has not yet completely recovered. Not only there was a catastrophic collapse of the Japanese stock market, but also very important banks and financial institutions failed one after the other. Now, we must focus our analysis on the reaction of the Japanese authorities to the bursting of the bubble and the arrival of the financial crisis. But before we do that, we must remember the four possible scenarios that can follow the bursting of an irrational, exuberant economy like this one of Japan. In the first scenario, the economic and monetary authorities might insist on continuing to inject money in a never-ending flight forward, which tries to prevent the arrival of the recession. Eventually, in this first scenario, a hyperinflation results, as we have seen at certain times in the past. For instance, following World War I, the case of the hyperinflation in Germany, that nearly destroyed that country's monetary system, and that, of course, helped bring Hitler to power. Although this first scenario is possible, and it has happened on different historical cases, it did not happen in the last cycle, nor in the case of Japan. The second scenario is exactly the opposite one. It consists of a total collapse of the banking system and the monetary supply. And if the monetary system disappears, it must evolve again from scratch. A new money must be chosen to replace the previously destroyed fiduciary money. This is another possible catastrophic scenario which did not happen either in the last cycle, nor in previous cycles, since central banks were precisely created to support private banks as much as necessary to keep them from suspending payments one after the other in chain reaction. The third scenario is usually the most common one. With great difficulty, and in spite of more or less timid, isolated monetary manipulations, the real economy ends up being restructured and adjusting to the new situation. In other words, productive factors are removed on a massive scale from unsustainable lines of investment, and in an environment of relatively free enterprise, entrepreneurs eventually recover their confidence and start to detect new sustainable lines of business and investment projects. In this way, the recovery gradually begins, little by little. It is true that human beings do not learn, and once a sustained recovery has occurred, political and institutional incentives will sooner or later lead to new artificial credit expansions, which will plant the seeds for the next cycle, and so on and so on. For instance, this third scenario has played out in the United States following the most recent US economic cycle. We must remember that the bubble originated in the US economy, and after the crisis, the Federal Reserve injected a large quantity of money. However, the American economy is one of the most flexible in the world. If something characterizes the American economy, is its remarkable capacity to quickly remove productive factors and reallocate them to other sustainable investments, discovered, of course, by an entrepreneurship that is quite free, restless, and creative. Therefore, despite all of the monetary aggression and growing interventionism in the American economy, again and again it ends up restructuring and starting path towards sustainable recovery. It is true that sometimes recovery is not complete. And even today, the American economy has not yet been fully restructured, nor has monetary policy been entirely normalized, as you know. Central bankers find it extremely hard to raise interest rates, and they are constantly looking for the smallest excuse to lower them. In this context, although long-term interest rates in the States were raised to 3%, more recently, in response to political pressures, not only has monetary normalization been paralyzed, but a step backward has been taken, and interest rates again have been lowered at least twice, a quarter of a point. But in any case, the American economy is highly flexible, and for that reason provides the typical example of a recovery that sooner or later becomes a reality. Finally, a fourth scenario is also possible, and arises when, in sharp contrast with the United States, the economic environment is very rigid, with high taxes, interventionism, and regulations. In this highly rigid context, when monetary authorities insist on injecting a large quantity of money, the syndrome I have called the Japanese economic illness, or economic Japanization, inevitably occurs. And this cocktail of great institutional rigidity, heavy taxes, highly regulated labor markets, together with the growing state intervention in the economy at all levels, intense manipulation, and unbridled injections of money is precisely what characterizes the economy of Japan and threatens to spread to other economic areas in the world, starting with the European Union. Indeed, The Japanese central bank responded to the bursting of the bubble with an overly lax monetary policy, in which it was decided that there would be a continual rollover of loans to offer zombie companies unable to repay their loans, new loans with which to pay off the old ones. In Japan, it is culturally unacceptable for a company to fail. It is culturally unacceptable for workers to be let go. Each company is like the mother of a large family, and she must keep all the members safe and employed. Though officially the unemployment figures may be very low, and everyone may seem to have a job, we must remember the photographs of those big departments in many Japanese companies where employees were seen sleeping or doing nothing. Officially, they are working, but obviously the hidden unemployment is massive. And the drop in productivity and the ongoing loss of competitive advantage are very high, especially with respect to China, South Korea, and the other emerging Asian economies. Moreover, interest rates were reduced almost to zero. And on top of that, the government added an aggressive fiscal policy which greatly pushed public spending. And of course, in an environment of great institutional and economic rigidity, massive monetary manipulation and the large increase in public spending block the necessary incentives to restructure the economy. As a result, productive factors are not transferred from the projects where they were erroneously invested during the bubble toward alternative sustainable lines of investment, which entrepreneurs could discover only in an environment of liberty, economic flexibility, and confidence. And this is how Japan entered an indefinite period of recession and economic lethargy that has already lasted several decades and from which it has not yet managed to emerge. Let us now recall the most recent attempt to stimulate the Japanese economy through an economic policy called Abenomics. It takes its name from its sponsor, the Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, who was helped by the governor of Japan's central bank, Haruhiko Kiruda. What does Abenomics consist of? It consists of doing more, much more, I would say, of the same. Japan has used and applied, and with great enthusiasm, the entire arsenal of monetary and fiscal interventionist prescriptions contained in the textbooks both of monetarists and Keynesians, but without achieving anything. In the last chapter of Abenomics, the Bank of Japan adopted an even more aggressive, if possible, and completely ultra-lax monetary policy. In fact, unconventional monetary policies originated not with the Federal Reserve, but beginning in March of 2011, precisely with the pioneering implementation of quantitative easing by the Japanese Central Bank. And all of this was combined with an additional, even larger and more disproportionate dose of public spending, which caused the fiscal deficit to skyrocket. And this prescription of much more of the same is what the Japanese authorities depended on to pull Japan out of its lethargy. Well, except for a short-lived economic improvement, which resulted from the depreciation of the yen and initially boosted exports somewhat, the lethargy again promptly returned. In short, nothing was achieved except to make Japan's economy the most indebted in the world. Japan's public debt is equal to 250% of its GDP. Remember that here in Europe we are criticizing, for instance, Portugal and Italy, whose indebtedness is between 120 and 135%. Or even Greece, with a figure of 180%. That is, these highly indebted European countries are roughly half as indebted as Japan is. And for the annual deficit in the Japanese public accounts, it is not, for instance, the 3% established as a limit in the Eurozone, nor even the 4% or the 5%. The annual deficit in the Japanese public accounts is 6%, while economic growth has nearly flatlined. In other words, this is a case of clear economic lethargy and very low inflation, interest rates around 0 or even negative rates, inflation of around 1%, and seemingly full employment with a very high volume of hidden unemployment and ongoing losses in productivity and competitiveness. To use a military term, Japan has already used up all its available interventionist ammunition. And not only has it not achieved anything, but the result has been highly counterproductive and disappointing. Everything that could be tried has been tried, and no goal has been reached. And now the key question is, why has nothing been achieved? And the answer is very clear, because in all these decades, in Japan, there have been no structural reforms to liberalize the economy, to liberalize the labor market especially, to introduce deregulation in the midst of a suffocating interventionism at all levels, to lower taxes across the board, to reorganize and balance the public accounts, nor even to reduce public spending. And although this is a very pitiful result, the main message of my lecture today is that this Japanese economic illness or syndrome could easily be transmitted to other economies and cease to be exclusive to Japan. In other words, this Japanization scenario could unfold in any other economy in which the same conditions exist and are responded to in the same way, namely, any highly rigid environment with no economic flexibility in which entrepreneurs are unable to recover the necessary confidence because they are overwhelmed with the regulations, taxes, intervention, and harassment of the state, along with serious monetary and fiscal manipulation. But before we analyze whether or not a risk exists of this happening in the European Union, let us first make some analytical reflections which will enable us to better understand what could happen if it is not already happening to us. Especially, what does Austrian economic theory have to say about this phenomena related to the Japanese economic illness or the syndrome of economic Japanization? According to the Austrian school, the only way to recover sustainable economic prosperity is to promote economic liberalization and free enterprise at all levels. There is no other way. This means that in very rigid economies, a number of fundamental structural reforms can be and must be carried out. Basically, these are all microeconomic in nature, and none has to do with a macroeconomic manipulation of the monetary supply or of fiscal spending. Politicians and monetary authorities inevitably fall to the temptation to engage in such macroeconomic manipulation in contexts of great institutional rigidity, financial crisis, and economic recession. Precisely, what do the necessary macroeconomic reforms consist of? Basically, they consist of systematically deregulating the economy, liberalizing markets, particularly the labor market, which is key in the case of Japan and also of the European Union. Also reducing the public sector and public spending, minimizing subsidies, and reforming the welfare state to return its responsibility to the private citizens. And finally, lowering the taxes that overburden economic agents, especially taxes on entrepreneurial profits and capital accumulation. We must remember that profits are the signals which guide entrepreneurs in their constant search for sustainable investments. And a tax system that falls on profits systematically distorts the traffic signals that guide the entrepreneurs in the market. And this inevitably makes economic calculation chaotic and gives rise to a misallocation of scarce resources. Also, taxes on capital have a particularly adverse effect on workers, and especially on the most vulnerable ones, since their pay depends on their productivity, which in turn depends on the accumulated amount of well-invested capital goods per worker. Therefore, to stimulate economic development and push up wages, What is needed is the per capita accumulation of an ever-increasing volume of well-invested capital goods. If capitalists are harassed and capital is taxed, the accumulation of capital is blocked at the expense of labor productivity and wages. All of these necessary reforms encourage the dynamic efficiency of our economies and promote an environment in which entrepreneurial confidence is quickly recovered. In this business-friendly environment, entrepreneurs can detect the investment errors committed in the bubble years and massively transfer the productive factors from projects in which they were mistakenly invested to sustainable investment projects. Certainly, these new sustainable investment projects are not going to be discovered, of course, by the state, nor by the government, nor public officials or experts, but only by an army of fully motivated entrepreneurs in a context in which they have recovered their confidence. What happens if, instead of encouraging these structural reforms, none of them is implemented? The economy remains very rigid, and the only actions taken, as happened in the case of Japan, are the massive injection of money supply, the lowering of interest rates to zero, and the increase in public spending. In this case, two very important effects are brought about. First, the ultra-lax monetary policy is always self-defeating. In other words, it prevents itself from fulfilling its intended goals, and thus it cannot possibly produce any of its expected results. Second, an ultra-lax monetary policy acts as a true drug, which blocks any political and institutional incentives to launch, support, and complete the necessary structural reforms. And as we can now easily realize, this is directly applicable also to us in Europe, especially if we remember the monetary policy of the European Central Bank during the last years. There are different reasons why an ultra-lax monetary policy is always self-defeating. To begin with, if the interest rate is forced down to almost zero, the opportunity cost of holding cash balances is practically eliminated. Ultra-lax monetary policies raises always the demand for money. Furthermore, when in a rigid economic environment structural reforms are not carried out, considerable uncertainty about the future spreads. And we must remember that a desire to be able to cope with future uncertainties is one of the main reasons why we demand money. Under such circumstances of great uncertainty in a rigid, highly controlled economy flooded with new injected money, where the opportunity cost of holding cash balances is zero, without a doubt, the most sensible thing to do is to significantly increase our cash balances. To this, we must add that many entrepreneurs are still fearful due to what they lost and suffered in the last financial and economic crisis. And they see that the economy is still highly controlled, that it is practically impossible to take a single step without asking permission from the authorities, that there are many bureaucratic and labor-related difficulties, and so on. Moreover, entrepreneurs are fully aware that if, in spite of all these difficulties, they are finally successful, the state, through corporate tax, income tax, and wealth tax, is going to take more than half of the profits they earn. Under such conditions, we can understand that the great temptation entrepreneurs face is to throw in the towel and avoid any trouble. Que invierta su puta madre. Well, the soft translation of que invierta su puta madre in English would be, let some other damn fool do the investment. As this widespread sentiment is so graphically expressed on these t-shirts my students here in this university originally designed and are so successfully distributed all around the campus. And there is one for free for each one available for you outside this floor. However, for central banks, The main solution lies in injecting massive amount of money and lowering interest rates to zero, so that the banking system will grant, theoretically, loans and people will decide to request them. But at the same time, they want bankers to avoid mistakes and wisely establishing all kinds of regulations and higher capital requirements. And in the end, what happens? Well, banks are not able to lend the money it is practically given them for free. And ordinary entrepreneurs as a group keep returning their old loans at a faster pace that they request new ones. And this causes an additional monetary contraction, which largely blocks and sterilizes the expected effects of the injection of money. For all these reasons, monetary injections are self-defeating. They do not achieve any of their objectives. They block and paralyze the recovery, and they never increase prosperity. And we come now to the maximum stupidity of negative interest rates. In a natural and controlled market economy, interest rates can never be negative. If the interest rate is negative, for instance, if I lend you 1,000 euros, and at the end of 1 year you have to return me only 990, for instance, obviously this is an encouragement for people to do nothing and avoid investing. It motivates people to leave the money in their pockets and a year later to pay back exactly 990 and make 10 euros without doing anything, without having to take on any entrepreneurial risks. If as an entrepreneur I invest and things go badly, I may not be able to return even the 990 euros. In contrast, with negative interest rates, the best thing to do is to request new loans without any limits. Sit on them and do nothing, and then pay back less than the borrowed amount. Keep the difference and make a sure profit without taking on any risk. Therefore, in conceptual terms, a negative interest rate leads directly to increasing ad infinitum the demand for money, to doing nothing, to lethargy, and to economic Japanization. Furthermore, the aberrant monetary policy of negative interest rates has another very harmful side effect. The negative interest is used to automatically finance the public deficit at no cost and without limit, thus blocking the few incentives that might remain for governments to implement any structural reforms. Negative interest rates encourage politicians to increase subsidies and vote buying, which inevitably sink our societies into populism. Indeed, we have a crystal clear illustration of what I'm talking about in our own country, Spain, as well, of course, as in the rest of Europe. Practically the same day the European Central Bank introduced quantitative easing in 2015, all reforms in Spain were paralyzed. Therefore, ultra-lax monetary policies of quantitative easing and negative interest rates do not achieve any of their objectives. They are self-defeating and they block the necessary structural reforms of economic liberalization. And now the final blow. Entirely disconcerted, central bankers see that they are achieving none of their objectives and they are simply turning their economies into drug addicts, since at the slightest mention of withdrawing the stimuli, the economies sink into recession. And as central bankers see no way out of this vicious circle they themselves have created, all that occurs to them is to recommend the adoption of fiscal policies of high increases in public spending. And this is even worse, because it distorts the real economy even further by placing a growing number of productive factors in projects which depend on the government and have no more sustainability than short-term political decisions. Employment depending on government spending is not sustainable in the long term, because it is not backed by consumers and only depends on the future decisions of politicians. And again, such fiscal policies prepare the ground even more, if that is possible, for the complete Japanization of our economies. Let us now elaborate the influence of the Japanese illness on other economic areas. I am not going to expand too much on the United States. I have already mentioned that the fundamental difference between the Japanese and the American economies is that the latter is far more flexible. That is why, despite all the errors and monetary aggressions, the American economy has been significantly restructured. However, there are still very large companies and sectors in the American economy that remain heavily dependent on cheap money. But in any case, the Americans have dared to raise interest rates, though they have done so very hesitantly and later lowered them again, which could mean they are in the typical starting phase of a new expansion of credit, which would in turn indicate the beginning of a new cycle within a few years. And the added uncertainty of new protectionist policies and the Brexit has been used by the Federal Reserve precisely as an excuse to temporarily suspend or even reverse its policy of monetary normalization. Again, on the slightest pretext, central bankers are always ready to justify lower interest rates, but they find it extremely difficult to start raising them. But we will not comment anymore on the US economy, and instead we will focus now on our own economic area, because the case of the European Union is far more interesting. To begin with, the policy of the European Central Bank has gone through two very different stages. During the first stage, which lasted until the year 2015, the ECB did not launch yet the aggressive quantitative easing, and the euro served to discipline the most spendthrift European governments, above all those of the periphery countries. A crisis of sovereign debt, not of the euro, of course, emerged in center countries, including Spain. And the European Central Bank used this crisis to force the implementation of the necessary reforms in various countries, including, again, Spain. The European Union even intervened Ireland, Greece, and Portugal. In the countries where reforms were put into effect, economies were restructured and eventually overcame the crisis. This is the case of our own country, Spain, in which the government, with great difficulty, in a very lukewarm manner, and committing the grave error of emphasizing tax increases over reductions in public spending, took anyhow several steps in the right direction, undertaking structural reforms. But the most serious problem has arisen during the second stage, from 2015 up to now. During this last stage, the ECB introduced, without any need, since M3 growth was already close to 4% at the beginning of 2015, its ultra-lax monetary policy of lowering interest rates to zero, and even less than zero. And especially it implemented its own very aggressive quantitative easing. In fact, the ECB actually purchased sovereign and corporate debt at a pace of 80 billion euros a month, which meant almost 1 trillion euros of newly created money per year. This was roughly equal to 10% of the GDP of the whole Eurozone for almost all of the 4 long years from 2015 through 2018, when the program was temporarily suspended, to be reintroduced again amid a strong controversy and with the express opposition of Germany, France, Holland, Austria, and other countries, very recently, precisely in this month, at a pace of 20 billion a month. This second stage of the ECB has been a disaster. At the very moment this ultra-lax monetary policy was initiated, as the case of Spain illustrates, all of the policies of structural reforms, reductions in spending, and liberalization that the very rigid European economy needed were suddenly suspended. Clearly, compared with Japan, Europe is composed of a heterogeneous set of economies. Some of Europe's economies were already on a relatively sound footing for several historical and political reasons, as is the case of the German economy. Other economies are very rigid and in a certain sense more Japanized despite their wealth. And these are the truly diseased economies of Europe. I am referring to France and particularly also to Italy. These economies have a very long list of pending structural reforms, and they have implemented practically none of them, especially since the ECB started purchasing their public debt. Finally, another group of countries had launched structural reforms in the right direction. Some of these countries, like Ireland and Portugal, and even Greece, have already nearly completed the reforms, while others, like Spain, are only halfway there. The countries that have managed to complete their reforms are very fortunate. But in Spain, all subsequent reforms, those which had been planned but were still pending, were suspended. If we are not careful, this will have a very high social and economic cost, especially if populism is strengthened based on the increases in taxes, subsidies, and public spending the current socialist administration has announced. In many ways, the German economy is paradigmatic. To begin with, it is an export power, of course. But how has Germany come to export so much? It exports so much because it produces very high quality products. And why does it produce products of outstanding quality? Because traditionally, the German entrepreneurial culture has developed in a very difficult trade environment. That is, with a currency, the old German mark, that was steadily appreciating, thus making it harder and harder to export anything. And in this context, the only way to export products is to produce the best ones in the world. In other words, under such circumstances, the Germans had no choice but to discover, innovate, produce, and introduce the very best products in the world. Weather vehicles, precision instruments, machinery, and so on. So, in spite of all the false logic around competitive monetary depreciations advocated by Keynesians and monetarists, Germany became one of the strongest export powers in the world. Against monetarists and Keynesians, it is a strong currency and not a weak one, which in the long run fuels entrepreneurial success and triumph as an exporter. Most analysts are conceptually impaired by their mathematical models, in which competitive depreciations appear to be the ideal recipe, since they immediately lead to an apparent short-term prosperity which derives from the increasing exports that every depreciation facilitates. But this prosperity is bread for today, hunger for tomorrow. It is fundamentally deceptive and short-lived, and it involves the unavoidable cost of dampening the creative and innovative entrepreneurial spirit, the drive to make things better and better. Why should we make an effort if, with a weak currency, our products sell themselves so easily? Remember my best test of a good economist. Monetary and fiscal manipulation will never produce sustainable economic prosperity, but just the opposite. Without a doubt, the ultra-lax monetary policy depreciated the euro, and this has permitted Germany in the short term to export products much more easily, and consequently, it has allowed Germany to neglect, relatively speaking, its traditional competitive advantage based on perpetual improvements in quality. The depreciated euro has acted like a drug for Germany. It has generated fat instead of muscle on the German economy, and to a certain extent has allowed it to rest on its laurels. As a result, Germany is now obliged to at least recover its lost muscle if the country does not actually go into a recession. France and Italy are horses of a different color. Their economies are extremely rigid, and it is practically impossible to carry through a single reform in them. Take, for instance, President Macron, with all of his promised reforms, practically none of which he has accomplished. Adopt reforms in France? Never! It is impossible. And so France, which is a very wealthy country, is rapidly approaching Japanization and the illness of indefinite lethargy. Italy's situation, though more picturesque, is even worse than that of France, if possible. As for the rest of the peripheral countries, we have already discussed them, especially our own country, Spain. All signs point to a slowing down of the economic growth Spain has enjoyed due to the timid reforms in the right direction adopted in the past and to a number of tailwinds that are tending to disappear. This situation certainly does not bode well, especially if, again, as the socialist administration is announcing, taxes and public spending are raised and regulations are tightened, like, for instance, minimum wage increases, the regulation of the rental market, the obligation for all workers to clock in at the work, and so on. Finally, I would like to conclude with a critical look at several economic myths we constantly read and hear, not only in the media, but also in professional journals. The first myth is that the increase in minimum wage in Spain from 600 euros to 900 euros a month, and eventually now to 1,000 and even to 1,200 euros, is not having a negative effect on employment. All of economic theory shows that rises in the minimum wage do boost unemployment, the underground economy, and the misallocation of the labor factor. Theoretically, the only way such a rise could possibly not have these negative effects would be if the government set the new wage lower than the already freely existing market wage. But in that case, why set one at all? As a general principle, if in the constellation of different jobs and wages, there is even one worker whose discounted value of his marginal productivity is less than the new legal minimum, that will be sufficient to keep that worker from being hired, or if already working, to cause that worker to be let go. Without a doubt, this measure in Spain will cause, and is already causing, unemployment and a misallocation of resources. Though in economics, of course, changes always take place gradually and at the margin. The very Bank of Spain, Central Bank of Spain, has published recently a study in which it predicts that at least 150,000 jobs will be destroyed. And these are jobs done by the most vulnerable people, young people just entering the workforce, women, immigrants, and so on. For instance, it is obvious that an immigrant who has with great difficulty managed to get his papers in order is going to have a very hard time finding a job if the minimum cost to the entrepreneur of hiring him is going to be, including social security costs, over 16,000 euros a year, 900 euros a month in 14 paychecks, plus 30% in social security costs for the entrepreneur. Nobody is going to hire him. And clearly, very few families also are going to be able to afford to pay 16,000 euros a year to the people who care for their elderly members or to their domestic workers, a sector which up to now has been employing hundreds of thousands of people in Spain. So, our immigrant will most likely be forced to wander from one place to another in the underground economy. The government hypocrisy in this matter is staggering. We welcome everyone. We will see in the building of the city mayor of Madrid. Refugees, welcome. But mind you, no one is going to find a job here in formal economy because now the minimum wage is 900 euros and the government plans to raise it to 1,000 euros and even to 1,200 euros per month. And why not to raise it to 2,000 or 5,000 or even 10,000 euros per month if employment will not be affected and the measure will be so positive for the economy? The second myth is that central banks saved our economies during the Great Recession. This is the myth of the arsonist fireman, for it was precisely German central bankers themselves who orchestrated the credit expansion and generated the bubble that later led inexorably to the crisis and the recession. And they now look like the ones responsible for saving the day because they kept banks from failing, at least in theory, because they saved, for instance, Bankia, very famous Spanish bank, but they allowed another Spanish bank, Banco Popular, to go under because it was smaller, But they even made greater mistakes before, like when they let Lehman Brothers collapse and everything else nearly collapsed with it. Clearly, central bankers have intervened in an irresponsible and ad hoc manner that generates great uncertainty and constant financial instability. The third myth is that of quantitative easing, that quantitative easing was necessary to avoid a deflationary crisis. This is untrue. For instance, the European quantitative easing was, as I said, completely unnecessary. When it was initiated in January 2015, the European M3 was already growing on its own at a rate of 4%. That is, at a rate very close to the reference target of 4.5% of the ECB. Quantitative easing was totally unnecessary. It has had a very damaging and self-defeating effect and has completely blocked the reforms the Eurozone needed. Even Mario Draghi's old rhetoric that monetary policy does not replace the necessary structural reforms the different countries must make to meet their Maastricht obligations was, after the quantitative easing, almost totally forgotten and replaced with a desperate request for more fiscal spending. By now, it is so obvious that no one is making structural reforms because the European Central Bank is financing governments for free that it would be a hypocritical to keep mentioning such reforms. It is obvious that the ECB has betrayed its founding principles. Ultimately, it is financing the public deficit of all the countries. Remember that it already owns 30% of the outstanding European public debt, including Spain's. Furthermore, it attempts to stimulate economic growth like the Fed when it has authority only to keep monetary stability, not to stimulate economic growth. Consequently, the ECB has become a hostage of its own errors, its ultra-lax monetary policy. The moment it announces it is withdrawing this policy, a recession will hit, and no one is willing to deal with it. And if the ECB continues to inject money, it will fully Japanize the Eurozone and sentence it to indefinite lethargy. And all this with a growing and constant discord between the members of the ECB Governing Council, which has been already almost completely politicized. The fourth myth, or rather, I would say dogma of faith, is that inflation must be less than 2%, but close to 2%. But why? Where did that magical figure come from? I will tell you. It came from mathematical models. All the experts locked themselves into a meeting room. I mean the governors of the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and so on. And bingo! They determined the rate should be 2%. But why 2%? It's a bizarre, totally arbitrary target, and one that is very difficult to reach in an environment in which productivity has risen as much as it has at the beginning of this century, as a result of the technological revolution and the introduction of numerous innovations. In this context, 2% is an unrealistic goal, and attaining it requires a super lax monetary policy which causes all of these negative effects we are discussing today. These effects destabilize the economy and the financial world, and as we have seen, they lead to the process of Japanization in rigid economies like the ones of Europe. A few years ago, I was invited with Professor Philippe Bagus to a meeting at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. The meeting was also attended by, among other experts, a former head economist of the European Central Bank. Well, we eventually arrived, after our discussions, at the conclusion that under the current circumstances, the inflation target should not be 2%, but 0%. And the reference target for M3 growth should be between 2 and 2.5% instead of 4.5%. If this had been the target, we would have been spared the ultra-lax monetary policy and Japanization process. And paradox of paradoxes, Very recently, there has been talk of making the target more flexible, but not to suspend the ultra-lax policy, completely unnecessary policy if the inflation target is lowered to 0 or 1%, but to the contrary, to justify higher inflation rates throughout the cycle, which compensate for the prior downward disparities. What a kind of spurious logic. The fifth myth you will have heard is that the natural rate of interest is falling. What hypocrisy! Central banks artificially lower the interest rate to 0 or even make it negative, and then they argue that the natural rate is dropping. But nobody can observe the natural rate of interest. All that can be observed is the gross interest rate in the credit market. In the absence of coercive intervention, this rate, as you know, includes the natural rate of interest, premiums for expected inflation or deflation, and risk premiums. It is so obvious that no one can observe the natural rate of interest that some people say, well, a proxy might be provided by the interest rate on risk-free public bonds. But one moment, it is precisely risk-free sovereign public bonds that central banks are compulsively buying, generating in their markets a bubble without any historical precedents. Again, what a hypocrisy. And the sixth and last myth we are going to discuss is the mantra that interest rates are very low because people are saving a lot because the population is getting old. It is said that Japanization is due to the fact that the Japanese population is aging more and more and saving a great deal. This argument is completely false and confuses saving with inflation. Inflation, of course, in the traditional Austrian sense of monetary growth. Benjamin Alderson, almost 75 years ago, used to say that, according to this argument, the bigger the injection of money, the greater the savings. Of course, money is injected, and people all hold it in their pockets, as we have seen. And then it is argued that people are doing a lot of saving. But no, what is happening is that there is an increase in the demand for cash balances, which is a stock, which should not be confused with an increase in saving, which is a flow. And as for the aging of the population, that argument is also weak. When people retire, they consume more, precisely what they have saved before. We must realize that in Japan, the demand for money has increased dramatically. And this increased demand is largely being channeled into government bonds, which are treated as cash. What a time bomb for Japan should the bond market collapse. I will now conclude where I began when I presented my alternative test to complement Hayek's. And my conclusion is that monetary and fiscal stimuli fail because they do not attack the underlying problem. The underlying problem is the rigidity of the economy. That is, excessive regulations, high taxes, unbridled public spending, and the resulting demoralization of entrepreneurs. An economy can emerge from a crisis and a recession only if the entrepreneurial class is motivated. I am not talking about Keynes' animal spirits, which make us manic depressive. We entrepreneurs have been harassed and demoralized by force. As long as the authorities continue making regulations, raising taxes, and giving money away, the easiest thing to do is to hold onto our money and let others do the investing if they want to. And of course, there are very few of them, if any. Furthermore, easy money blocks the implementation of any free market reforms and makes them politically impossible. So the only way our economies can escape Japanization is blocked. And what is our only escape from this problem toward which we are dangerously sliding in the Eurozone? What is the only way out of this vicious circle we are dangerously entering? Well, that is clear. We must Normalize monetary policy as soon as possible and create a framework that forces governments to implement the painful structural reform measures our economies need. The current ultra-lax monetary policy benefits only a few: spendthrift governments and holders of fixed income securities, hedge funds and speculators, to the great detriment of most citizens, particularly millions and millions of small savers that are trying and fighting to build their future pensions. Also, this Keynesian euthanasia of the saver policy has created a bubble in fixed income markets that even dwarfs the real estate bubble generated before the last Great Recession. Once we normalize monetary policy, governments will be obliged to control their spending, to introduce austerity policies again, and encourage the necessary liberalization reforms, which were suspended or postponed at the wrong time, and which we desperately need today in order to recover our former sustainable prosperity. Thank you very much to all of you.